So, Loyal, one of the things that I think in every evening program that I do, typically I'll preach on a Sunday morning, or Connie will preach at a different church on a Sunday morning, and then I always do a free follow-up program in the evenings. It's typically about an hour long and then half-hour Q&A. And I've got a quote that I use from Religion is Not About God. The most profound insight in the history of humankind is that we should seek to live in accord with reality. Indeed, living in harmony with reality may be accepted as a formal definition of wisdom. If we live at odds with reality, foolishly, then we'll be doomed. But if we live in proper relationship to reality, wisely, then we'll be saved. And then you go on to say something like, all cultures have had at least a tacit understanding of this fundamental principle. What we're less in agreement about is how we should think about reality and what we should do to put ourselves into harmony with it. And so the way I typically introduce this book, Religion is Not About God, the subtitle, How Spiritual Traditions Nurture Our Biological Nature and What to Expect When They Fail. I like to say that religion is not about God, religion is about our relationship to reality, and that if religions are failing in helping us live in right relationship to what's fundamentally inescapably real, then they are failing really in their evolutionary purpose.
Maladaptive.
Yes, exactly. And so then you go on and the middle part of your book is where you actually take a number of different religious traditions and then take a look at how they provided personal wholeness, social coherence, how they helped really provide a mythic map of what's real and what's important, or how things are and those things matter. So anything you'd like to say about what motivated you to write that book, and sort of what's the, like if you were to tell people, what's the essence, if somebody says, well, Loyal, tell me, what's this book, Religion is Not About God? What do you mean by that? What's that book about?
Yeah. Well, I think this book was inevitable from my childhood. I grew up in a very traditional religious family, and we thought my father had been a pastor. My mother spent much of her career in the headquarters of the Lutheran Church. So religion was always there, ever present. And so I thought a lot about it and kept on thinking about it, and eventually I knew that I would try to formulate some sort of global theory of religion, and that's what this book tries to explain what religion is. And I picked this title, Religion is Not About God, to emphasize what it's not about rather than what it is about. What it is about is us, and it's about basically helping us, working with the strings of human nature, to try to enhance our ability to achieve personal wholeness and social coherence, personal fulfillment, and social cooperation simultaneously.
Yes.
So here's the evolutionary view. My view is that our chances are enhanced, our chances of survival are enhanced to the extent that we can achieve personal fulfillment and social cooperation simultaneously.
Correct.
To the extent that we do that, we optimize our chances for survival. And religious, of course, our inherited emotional systems, drive systems, and so on, do a lot to help us achieve those things. But in a cultural setting, we need additional resources, and the story provided, or the myth provided by religion, provides us with additional resources for managing our nature, so that we can achieve those things. So basically, and of course this will offend some people, but basically I think that religion is therapy and politics. Therapy, that is, religion appeals to the needs of individuals for personal wholeness, and the politics part appeals to our need for social coherence. That in a way reflects a long-standing tradition in Christianity that Christianity talks about the two natures of Christ, but it also talks about the two roles of the Christ figure, the priestly role and the prophetic role. The priestly role is what I mean by therapy, and the prophetic role is what I mean by politics. So there's the personal and the public. And if there's one language, a unified vocabulary that we can appeal to help us enhance our therapy and our politics using one language, then we're in good shape. If we can do that, we optimize our chances for survival. So religion is about the biological imperative to survive.
Yeah. Survive at both at the level of the individual, but the level of the multicellular organism that you call a community.
You don't get a social order without a personal order. You don't get personal wholeness without social coherence. You don't get social coherence without personal wholeness. These two things support each other, but they also compete with each other, because the personal side, right, the individual, always wants more of the commons than it has a right to, and the social order, the state, always asks for more from the individual than the individual really can. They'll bleed you dry. So these are at war with each other, but they need each other. So they're mutually beneficial, but also
there's a tension.
Yeah, lots of tension between them. But if we can achieve those two, and of course it's constantly in flux, but if we can achieve those two things simultaneously, then we have a good chance of survival. And our chance of achieving these two things simultaneously is enhanced by having one vocabulary that can address both the personal and the political.
Yeah, I remember reading over a decade ago now John Stewart's book Evolution's Arrow, where he talked about the necessity of aligning self-interest at multiple levels, so that an individual pursuing its own self-interest is simultaneously pursuing the self-interest of the social whole that they're part of, and by pursuing the social whole, they get the emotional benefits and the sort of the personal wholeness aspect, and that a system is well designed when that happens, and a system is dysfunctionally designed when I can pursue my own self-interest and get really wealthy at the expense of the larger community that I'm a part of. And that's of course where we are now, is we've got an economic and political system where it's possible for an individual or corporation to get wealthy by toxifying the air, water, soil, and life upon which we all depend. So it's a fundamental design flaw. One of the things you talk about in there, actually, you mentioned a little bit also in Everybody's Story, the ancillary strategies. In addition to having a mythic map of what's real and what's important, or how things are, which things matter, that bring these sort of, as you say, therapy and politics together for personal wholeness and social coherence, there are other things that come along that allow that or facilitate the mythos, the story, the sort of the root metaphor of the nature of reality and how to live in right relationship with it. Say a little bit about some of these. I think there were 5 of them.
I think you might think of a religious tradition as a house that's been tacked together feebly. It keeps falling apart. You have to keep putting it back together. Image I like even better comes from my college days. In the summer, I used to work on construction crews as a laborer. And we had this foreman who used to just hate it when the laborers would stand around waiting for the delivery of the concrete truck, or waiting for a delivery of some lumber shipment or some iron or something. So if there was no work to do, we'd just stand around. He hated to see people getting paid for standing around. And so he used to get a hose and a bunch of brooms, and he'd put the hose on some concrete or parking lot or wherever he could find some concrete, and he'd put the hose out there and tell us laborers to sweep it into a pile. So we would sweep this water, which kept threatening to plane out. We had to try to sweep that into a pile. That's what a religious tradition is like. It's like sweeping water into a pile, because there's so many things that want to tear the tradition down. And so that's how I view these ancillary strategies. If you look at religion, what you see is music and worship and stuff like that. So, and these I take to be strategies for holding together the central story. The story itself is the essence of the religious tradition, and these activities that you see empirically are activities that are intended to keep the story alive and keep it transmitted. And those strategies, or supporting strategies, or ancillary strategies, call them what you will, are intellectual. For example, there are always philosophers and theologians or thinkers in the story tradition that will help to clarify the story, to interpret the story, and to defend it against criticism from the outside. So that's the intellectual part. There's the aesthetic part, which is the artful presentation of the story, which it draws people in. There is the institutional part. Somebody's got to decide if there are going to be meetings and who's going to preside over the meetings, and somebody's got to decide when two warring factions start to disagree with each other. There has to be some sort of polity that settles disagreements and so on. That's the institutional part. And then there's the, I mentioned the aesthetic part, the ritual part. The ritual part is activities that enable people to bring the experiences of the person, of the individual, into line with the experiences of the group or the experience of the cosmos or whatever is in the story, so that a person can actually take ownership of the story. And then the experiential part, every tradition wants people to have the kind of experiences that are memorable and really create emotional markers so that a person can continually refresh that story. So these are the things that you see when you look at a tradition, and what they're doing is they're sweeping together the story to keep it intact so that it can be transmitted from one generation to another and from one culture to another or whatever.
Yeah, and it's those five things: the intellectual, the aesthetic, the ritual, the institutional, and the experiential, that I have done some reflecting, as I'm sure you have, in terms of if religious naturalism, either outside the existing religious traditions or also within the various religious traditions, really is to take off, there will need to be attention to those five as well. And obviously that'll be differently in terms of how Baptists and Lutherans and Catholics and Protestants and Buddhists and Quakers and all the different religious traditions, Hindus and whatever, take on religious naturalism, or what Ron Taylor calls dark green faith, will happen differently because they've already got some of those elements, some of those five elements, than those of us who may be saying, okay, we're going to step outside of any existing previous religion and create or co-create or evolve a purely science-honoring, earth-respecting, form of religiosity that may now just be it may just be just little seeds. It doesn't have any of those five, but 200, 300 years from now, on the other side of the great challenges coming down the pike, can take off in the same way that Christianity took off in the collapse of the Roman Empire.
You can see it emerging already, even as we speak. There are organizations that are forming themselves. There's something called the Religious Naturalist Association, RNA, that is drawing up bylaws, and they have a board of directors, and they're going to, and they're going to have a kind of mission and all the rest of it. This is the institutional aspect of the new story of cosmogenesis forming. There's the Big History Association. That's another, and these are things that draw people in. They sign on to, and then there are mission statements, and there are this is what it means to belong to this thing. So the institutional aspects are starting. I think there's a pantheistic world pantheism.
World pantheism.
Yeah. So there are attempts out there already to put together the institutional aspects, which will then work to add some of the other elements. There are aesthetic elements that are starting to appear, so these ancillary strategies that we see in all the other traditions that are well established are in their nascent form, in their early forms, beginning to emerge around religious naturalism.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to watch those things develop.
Yeah. I mean, the way I've started talking about it are terms that aren't currently being rejected because they're not being embraced because they're just too new. There's a lot of people that haven't heard them, but they're sort of bringing together sort of sacred words and secular words in a way that is that I'm trying to provoke people's curiosity, and so I talk about factual faith or sacred realism in addition to religious naturalism. I also refer to it as the evidential reformation, that in Christianity you've got sort of the Catholic, which is the authority of elders, what I call religion or Christianity 1.0, Christianity 2.0, the Protestant Reformation, the authority of Scripture, and Christianity 3.0 is the authority of evidence, the authority of global collective intelligence and science. And God 3.0 moves beyond belief or disbelief. It's about honoring reality. It's about honoring reality as evidentially known, whether you personify that or not. I think that the evidential reformation will actually end up making the Protestant Reformation look small in comparison, because it really is about something that is likely to continue for, if humanity survives, for thousands of years.
Because it's self-correcting.
It's self-correcting, and it's
which
grounded
means
in
it's
big
sustainable.
history.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's been the problem with most of the religious traditions that we have established, is that they aren't self-correcting.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, in fact, this is good, because this is, in this conversation, I'm trying to find distinctions that I can use. I talk about the distinction between a factual God and a fictional God. The fictional gods can only be experienced in the literature and in your subjective experience. I mean, Harry Potter is a fictional character. I can read about Harry Potter in the literature. I can close my eyes and have an imaginary conversation with Harry Potter, but I can't experience Harry Potter with my senses in the real world. So God...
Cecil B. DeMille offers us something.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well,
yeah, but God understood as a supernatural being outside the universe would qualify as a fictional.
Right.
Factual God is God, reality personified, nature personified, time personified, and then it's not a matter of believing in Poseidon or not believing in Poseidon. The seas are real, whether you personify them or not. Eros, you don't believe in Eros or not believe in Eros. Eros is the personification of erotic energy or whatever.
Yeah. So one question might be this: why personify? I think it transmits better, doesn't it? It transmits better. Somehow we're wired
Yes,
for.
exactly.
Most of our sensory systems and so on are keyed to taking in information about other persons, and so if you turn your face to the sky, you're going to see people up there, just by nature, and so we're able to process things a little bit better if they are personalized or personified.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. How do we prevent these personifications from being reified in such a way
That's a great question.
that they carry the kind of authority
Yeah.
that we loathe
Right.
in these imaginary?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I sometimes, as we shared earlier, but I'll go ahead and share now since we're not being recorded. Connie and I personify this continent as Nora. So we say we've got this intimate personal relationship with Nora. Notice we give it a female name. Instead of North America, we say Nora. And we actually have a more juicy, yummy relationship with this continent simply by personifying this continent as Nora. It probably wouldn't take more than 2 generations, my great-grandchildren, to say, yeah, Grandma and Grandpa, they believe that this continent has spirit called Nora. In other words, they decouple the personification from the reality personified, and then we've got now the spirit. Grandpa and Grandma believed in the spirit of North America that they called Nora, as if it was the god of this continent, rather than, Poseidon as the personification of the seas, not the god of the seas or the spirit of the seas. I don't know how to keep that from happening. Prior to written language, how would you hold the complex knowledge about the movement of the stars, for example, for planting, the importance of, telling time by the stars?
Right.
You're more likely to remember that if it's personified, if it's told in a narrative form.
Yeah, it wouldn't even have to be person, actually, because there are other metaphors that would work. A lot of cultures have talked about the cosmos as a kind of plant, a seed that grows and develops and so on. And so there's a good
Right.
metaphor.
Yeah.
Once it has a name, then it can be dealt with as a reality.
Exactly. And so I'm not trying to say that we should go back to personifying in some kind of unconscious sense. And I don't know how do we keep from reifying are personifications.
That's a problem. Yeah.
But I do know that
Well,
I do suspect that we will not survive if we continue to have a disrespectful, or what I sometimes say dishonorable, relationship to nature. So anything else that because you actually spend the whole middle chunk or about a third of your book is really on taking each one of the traditions.
Yeah.
And so anything do you want to say?
Yeah, well, it sort of speaks for itself. I lay out the theory of religion, and then I try to show how that is reflected within each of these 5 religious traditions. And then at the end, I speculate about the future of religion. But interesting sideline here is that when I was writing this book, I shared bits of it as I was writing with a good friend of mine, Gordon Kaufman, blessed memory, who reacted to it, and we had a big debate about it. I think I finally convinced him, so I think I finally won. But his reaction was, "Loyal, this is not empirical. This is not the way to do it. You have to be empirical. You have to be empirical." And what he meant was, you study every religious tradition in the whole universe, right? And then you start to generalize from those religious traditions. And my argument was, it is empirical, but that's not the only way to do empirical. It's the inductive way. You can do it by a sort of deductive method too. So my method was to start with human nature, because the assumption was that religious traditions are nurturing our behavioral systems.
Right.
And so I start with an understanding of human nature, put together a theory of religion, and then take that theory and test it out in the field. And that's empirical.
Yeah.
And so if these traditions don't fit the model, then, so he's working bottom up, and I'm working top down. But he was finally convinced that it was empirical enough. And so these 5 chapters just try to show how each of these traditions have a central mythic core that integrates cosmology and morality, and that each of these traditions has their own versions of these strategies for maintaining and transmitting the story. And I picked the 5 that are the most obvious world religions, even though they aren't the largest. Certainly Christianity and Buddhism and Islam are, but Judaism isn't very large.
Right, exactly.
But it certainly has been hugely influential.
Have you read Stewart Guthrie's Faces in the Clouds?
No.
When did you read that?
Well, I read it when it came out, because...
Like in 95 or something like that?
Yeah, actually I read it... Did it come out in 95?
94, I think.
Yeah, I think it was 94, because when I was preparing By the Grace of God,
Yes, I did.
my editor, Cynthia Reed at Oxford Press, she was also vetting Stewart Guthrie's book, Faces in the Clouds, and so she sent it to me. I don't remember if she sent it to me in manuscript form or in galley form or what. I don't remember the form, but I read it. I think before it hit the stand. So
yeah, because I've found that. I mean, the way I've been speaking about it lately is that I would argue that the most significant scientific discovery about religion in the last 100 years is that our brains are inherently relational, and the primary way that we relate is through personifying, and that's what gives us that I-thou respectful relationship.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways I interpret Amythia is that we have been lacking not only a coherent myth, but we've been lacking a honorable relationship with nature because we've been treating it as a myth.
Right.
So that was the only piece that I found in Religion is Not About God that I would have wanted sort of a little more integration, because it seemed clear that you had been familiar with Guthrie, but because personification is so not just central to my own understanding of the nature of religious consciousness, but also the whole field of evolutionary religious studies now. Even the evangelicals within that community, which are not a lot, but a few of them, Justin Barrett, for example, doesn't deny the centrality of anthropomorphism or
Right.
personification for understanding the nature of religion. And I find that a huge advance, rather than thinking of gods or spirits or whatever as disembodied entities or just fictions, that they're personifications of some aspect of our inner or outer reality.
But yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear from an evolutionary point of view why that is, because nothing in our environment really is more consequential in terms of benefit and threat
Yes, exactly.
than other persons,
Yes, exactly.
conspecifics.
Yeah.
That's not true of every species, but it certainly is of ours. And so we are keyed to picking up all kinds of clues from that will help us predict the behavior of others.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When you think about it, we're the first culture to ever not have an honorable relationship to that reality. We treat it just as the sun. Every culture that can you give me a counterexample of any culture that didn't in some way relate to that as a divine being of some sort? If we dishonor the sun, we're fucked.
No, of course, no question about it. Yeah.
And that's why Earth and Sun,
Yeah.
I mean, there's sort of natural realities
Yeah.
we've been lacking a respectful, honorable relationship to. A humble, like we were talking about earlier. We don't have humility before that reality. We don't have humility about this reality. And I think that's one of our problems.
Yeah, we put on sunglasses and sunscreen and so to protect ourselves.
Right. Well, in a heating world, I think we will gain that humility again. It'll be forced upon us.
Yeah, I quite agree. I think, look, what I don't do anymore is write books. I've done that. I started repeating myself, and I write mumbles now.
Poetry? What do you mean by mumbles?
Well, mumbles. That's what old men do. They mumble, and mumbles are not intended to be heard by the public, and so it's just sort of talking to themselves.
Right.
If I'm inspired to write a mumble while I'm chopping wood or something, I'll come inside here and I'll sit down and write a mumble. And one of the mumbles I wrote, I'm not going to share my mumbles with you, but one of the mumbles had to do with this didn't really happen, but it sort of happened over time. It's a sort of composite of events, but the event effectively happened. When I was a child, my mother, when Thanksgiving came along, we would be at Thanksgiving dinner, and she would ask each one of us to name what we were thankful for. And so we would say, "Oh, I'm thankful for food. I'm thankful for the house, and I'm thankful for loving." And so we would go around. And of course, the next thing was that she would then remind us that without the bounty of the Lord God Almighty, we wouldn't have any of these things. And so really we're thankful to God for all these things. And so one year at Thanksgiving dinner, my mother asked us to go around the table and say what we are thankful for. And my eldest brother paused for quite a while and then finally said, "The Big Bang." And my next elder brother took his turn and said, "Gravity." And then my sister said, "Radiation." And I said, "Friction." And Mother said nothing at all. That didn't happen that way,
Exactly.
but it happened,
Yeah,
Okay,
no, exactly.
so that's a mumble.